Hello, YouTube. Um, I was going through some videos because I was, I had a spare the moment kind of need to go and check out some ideas about the Cambrian explosion, and it was actually a bit about when did eyes evolve? How did they come about? Something like that. Were they responsible for this event, you could say, in a few million years called the Cambrian explosion, some half a billion years ago, right? And I came across this. I've seen this guy Lex Friedman podcast before. He has had some interesting guests on, so he's sort of on the cool side of things, sort of old school, right? But have some decent guests and has a large number of followers. Should could be interesting, right? And he has this guy Lex Friedman on talking about the Cambrian explosion. I suppose he's some kind of academic and an expert on the Cambrian explosion and so on, right? It was just that why I'm doing this, I'm trying to come up with a good explanation. I was just, hoping to get sort of the latest news on the case and so on, right? What are there are sort of traditionally some gray areas in explaining various events in the development of life and so on, right? Or the manifestation of life. Living beings and fossils and so on. There are some things apparently that still sort of hard to explain and fit into the picture, but most people tend to think that it's a matter of time before they sort of settled on this. And I was in this mode of thinking when I said, yeah, well, I thought to myself, this is just the same as when materialists say that, okay, but the mind-body problem or the heart problem or consciousness is just a matter of time before somebody put the right electrodes on and say, aha, and that's why there's mind, right? It's the same kind of it's the same kind of trust, you can say, but it's different, and that's why it's interesting, this one, right? And I don't want to ruin the surprise, but I was like, okay. It came sort of out of the blue, but it fits the picture, fits in the picture. I don't know why I can't express myself today, but I'm apparently having a brain fart, right? And it ties into some comments about my recent deconstruction and criticism of Bernardo Castro, right? So let's hit it.
What's the biggest mystery or gap in understanding about evolution? Is it the Cambrian explosion? And if so, what's our best understanding of how to explain, first of all, what is it? In my understanding, in the short amount of time, maybe 10 million years, 100 million years, something like that, a huge number of animals, diversity of animals were created. Anyway, there's like 5 questions in there.
Yeah.
Is that the biggest mystery?
No, I don't think it's a particularly big mystery really anymore. I mean, there are still mysteries about why then, and I've just said sulfate being washed into the oceans is one. It needs oxygen, and oxygen levels rose around that time. So probably before that, they weren't high enough for animals. What we're seeing with the Cambrian explosion is the beginning of predators and prey relationships. We're seeing modern ecosystems, and we're seeing arms races, and we're seeing the full creativity of evolution unleashed. And so I talked about the boring billion. Nothing happens for 1.5 billion years. The assumption, and this is completely wrong, this assumption, is then that evolution works really slowly, and that you need billions of years to affect some small change, and then another billion years to do something else. And it's completely wrong. Evolution gets stuck in a stasis, and it stays that way for tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years. And Stephen Jay Gould used to argue this. He called it punctuated equilibrium, but he was doing it to do with animals and to do with the last 500 million years or so, where it's much less obvious than if you think about the entire planetary history. And then you realize that the first 2 billion years was bacteria only. You have the origin of life, 2 billion years of just bacteria, oxygenic photosynthesis arising here. Then you have a global catastrophe, snowball Earths and great oxidation event, and then another billion years of nothing happening, and then some period of upheavals, and then another snowball Earth, and then suddenly you see the Cambrian explosion. This is long periods of stasis where the world is in a stable state and is not geared towards increasing complexity. It's just everything is in balance. And only when you have a catastrophic level, global level problem, like a snowball Earth, it forces everything out of balance and there's a tipping point and you end up somewhere else. Now, the idea that evolution is slow is wrong. It can be incredibly fast. And I mentioned earlier on, you can, in theory, it would take 500,000 years to invent an eye, for example, from a light-sensitive spot. It doesn't take long to convert, one kind of tube into a tube with knobbles on it, into a tube with arms on it, and then multiple arms, and then at one end is a head it starts out as a swelling. It's not difficult intellectually to understand how these things can happen. It boggles the mind that it can happen so quickly, but we're used to human timescales. And what we need to talk about is generations of things that live for a year in the ocean. And then a million years is a million generations, and the amount of change that you can affect in that period of time is enormous. And we're dealing with large populations of things where selection is sensitive to pretty small changes and can. So again, as soon as you throw in the competition of predators and prey, and you're ramping up the scale of evolution, it's not very surprising that it happens very quickly when the environment allows it to happen. So I don't think there's a big mystery. There's lots of details that need to be filled in. I mean, the big mystery.
Okay, so this is where he talks about the big mystery, right? And I was actually surprised that it came, because it's sort of out of left field, right? And it sort of almost muted the interviewer, right? No, I find this a fascinating science, right? Or history, part of evolution, and this arms race he's talking about. I find that to be a very good, also an analogy for the human explosion, you could say, right? Which has been going on for, since the human beings started to exist and maybe have an idea that they exist and so on, right? Be sort of metaconscious or something like that, being aware of themselves. It's like 200,000 years or something like that, right? And you can go say 8 million years, go way back in time, right? But nothing much happened to these monkeys that eventually became us or me, right? Except for the last, like 400 or 500 years, right? It's like, woof, all of a sudden, an explosion in humans, right? And it's sort of, it takes a long time, and sort of, the moment, it's sort of the exponential growth, right? You don't see the little increments that are actually decent increments in the beginning when you look at the big picture when something incredible happens, right? Because then it's escalating exponentially, and this is just how things happen, right? It's just about when things develop, then it's when somebody moves fast, the competition has to move faster, and it's sort of this arms race, right? So if there's no threats to your survival, you keep doing the same thing because there's no reason to be different. But when you need to adapt, all of a sudden things have to escalate, right? Okay, so that's just sort of my comments on. I always been fascinated by the Cambrian explosion, and mostly also because I always is triggered by become interested when there's something that hasn't been explained. You know, right? In what I mean, right? I always been interested in the case of Jack the Ripper, for instance. Not that I like, the idea of cutting up women or anything like that, but the fact that it's unsolved and it's this crazy, murders that happened in London, right? And every sort of 5 years, I dive into what's the latest, news about who might it have been, right? And it's just something alluring about that which hasn't been explained, you could say, right? But then he throws in the bomb here, right?
In biology is consciousness.
The big mystery in biology is consciousness. Well, intelligence is kind of a mystery too.
Consciousness is that this is a sure sign of a materialist. This guy here, right? Or not that guy, but the guy who just Lex Friedman, right? That a materialist see consciousness, though I'm not necessarily particularly fond of the term consciousness because it's so diluted, right? But let's just stick to it. That it's a part of this story being told. It is to some extent, but it's not something that can be explained by the same tools that they're using to explain the Cambrian explosion, right? It's like you're seeing yourself from the outside. That's the fallacy. You are looking at yourself from the outside in an abstracted form. It's like you're creating this story about what has been going on, and what is going on you could even add, right? But what has been going on, this story is sort of an official narrative that is based on science, usually, but not always, right? You can say patriarchy is not a part of biology, right? If it exists at all, right? Or the society, you can take a biology book, open up and say, hey, I'll have to check what is society made of. You can't do that, right? So these are abstractions. And the point I want to get to is this thing he's referring to, whatever he's referring to, is always based on this consciousness. And then consciousness is used to create this story, which he places himself in outside himself. And then he says, at some point, this came to be conscious, or I came to be conscious about this story, right? So this moving the horse in front of and behind the cart, this problem is known as the heart problem. He is referring basically to the heart problem of consciousness, right? It should be explainable by biology or something like that, right? Which is completely crazy, right? And I know that Bernardo Castro would be, I would presume, agree with me on this point, right? It's not going to arise from biology or physics or anything like that. Because you're in the middle of it. You're just extracted yourself from it and looking at yourself from the outside in an abstracted form. And then you expect to get an explanation from there. You can't do that, right? It's ridiculous. Now, why am I critical of Bernardo Castro then? Because he tells me he has empirical evidence for mind outside mind. Not only does he have empirical, right? Scientists or biologists, they are hardcore empiricists, I would suspect, right? Otherwise, they're not good biologists. They are always looking at something, listening to something, touching something, and smelling something, and so on, right? In order to get to an idea about the evidence for that which they're creating the story, right? Now, if Bernardo Castro says he has evidence for, first of all, that there is, which is he doesn't actually argue for. He just said, of course there's an outside. And then he says, and then outside my experience, I can use my experience to clarify what is, which is basically saying he has empirical evidence for mind beyond mind, right? Or empirical evidence for what that is, which is beyond mind. And he says it's also mind. That he cannot do, right? Because he's as stupid as the materialists, right? He just realizes he can't say, without going into some very harebrained stuff like dualism, he can't say what it is unless he says it's mind. Then he can keep going. And then he just says, well, I guess then it's mind then, right? And then he cherry picks some woman in Germany who was hit on the head and said she had a dream that another man also had, right? And that is actually empirical evidence for whatever he wants to claim is empirical evidence. He can't do that. You have to have direct experience of whatever it is you claim, which is exactly what you cannot have if it's beyond your experiences. And that's why Bernardo Castrop is fucked up, right? He can't see this, right? He just needs to bring in the idea of empiricism so that people say, okay, I guess I have to bow down because he brought in empiricism. Nobody, trust the science, Dr. Fauci, right? Take your jabs because science. And that's why it's philosophers have apparently done such a bad job at explaining this paradox there is about your experience and the default setting in human beings, which is materialism, that and when they get old enough to understand without falling completely apart. I wouldn't discuss these matters like idealism with children, right? And not even maybe teens, right? You have to at least be a teen, right? But I would say late teen, right? Maybe 16, 17, when they're sort of so grown up that they can almost take care of themselves, right? Then you could discuss these things. I wouldn't do it with children, right? Pre-teens, right? At all, right? It's a scary. It's like explaining that a meteor might destroy Earth at some point, right? With a 4-year-old. Don't do that, right? So what I'm getting to is how can, if the so-called sharpest minds in the world cannot wrap their head around this thing called consciousness, and those who can just venture into whatever they basically want to be the case, who the hell is going to straighten this out, right? Well, first of all, you need to convince yourself, or not convince, but you need to do things yourself before you start listening to what others have come up with, right? Otherwise, there's just some empty hole in your understanding where you might just fit whatever pleases you to be a part of the story of your philosophy, right? I would say you have to develop your philosophy before you attempt adapting somebody else's. Because if you're just adapting it, it's unphilosophical. Because you haven't thought about it. You're just saying, I want that, right? Sounds like something. And usually what people do is, what fits with the agenda of my family, of my mother, of my whatever, all those in your vicinity, the Christians, the priest, and so on, right? What kind of story fits with that? And then you adopt that, right? Like most of these idealists do. They're idealists because they want to justify Christianity, for instance, or even Buddhism, or maybe not Buddhism, but Islam and whatever, right? Because then they can connect the dots. They can be empirical and say, yeah, you have to be empirical in your everyday, and you could use it to prove some, idealist philosophy. And then at the same time, they want to combine it with the woo-woo shit they were force-fed as children, right? Okay, I think it's enough, and I hope you enjoy the show. This was just sort of a one-off. I'm still in a thinking box about how to approach many beats. At this point, I feel pretty confident that I'm going to I'm not going to delete the channel or anything like that. I want to keep it, and also it's mirrored on other sites like Odyssey and Rumble, right? So it will sort of always be there, you could say. But I will transition into a different approach to things. And the transition point will be the writing of the book I've been doing for years. And I want to get it done now. I can't keep waiting. I might not live forever, right? So I better get going. And at this point in time, I have some spare time to use. And why not use it proficiently, right? So I want to get going with that. And that I would change my sort of the energy I use on Manibil, I will change into using in some kind of support platform or platforms for the book. And, I would expect there to be, if I publish a book, it might take us a while, Quay, the Cambrian explosion, and, it might take time before it sort of escalates into, if it gets popular, right? Which I hope, of course, right? But it doesn't have the same appeal maybe as 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson, right? Which is, hey, do this, do that, do this, do that, brush your teeth, and wipe your ass, whatever, right? Which is stupid, right? I'm not particular about wiping your ass, but the approach to philosophy and morality, right? It's like, I have received the 12 commandments from my God, right? Fuck off, Jordan B. Peterson, man. Oh. But so I will change my main focus to the book, and then whatever this doing here turns out to be, maybe a different channel and maybe a Substack or something that will turn into a support mechanism for after I have published my book, right? Maybe slightly before. I don't know how. I haven't settled on anything particularly yet, but I have a decent idea of where I want it to go, and just to get some traction in my philosophy, right? Or presenting my philosophy. This is not. I'm not going to catch the ear of the world. I might have a Cambrian explosion at some point, but I don't know if it's coming, right? I can't wait another 500 million years, right? I'm still on bacteria state here, right? Okay, enough of that. I'm happy that you listened in. Please share, like, and subscribe. Otherwise, have a nice day. See you in the next one.